Talk, I'm Eun Cho. Presidents Trump and Moon reaffirmed their pledge to provide a bright future for North Korea after it denuclearizes. Today, we look at the results of the latest US-ROK summit and also discuss ways to produce substantial progress in the upcoming working-level talks between the US and North Korea.
His country is full of tremendous untapped potential, but that to realize that promise, North Korea must denuclearize.
3차 북미 정상회담이 열린다면 아마도 한반도의 비핵화의 새로운 질서가 만들어지는
In the studio with me today, Mr. Robert Einhorn, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. Mr. Einhorn served as Special Advisor for Non-Proliferation and Arms Control at the State Department. Also joining me, Mr. Scott Snyder, Director of U.S.-Korea Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, Negotiating on the Edge, focuses on the U.S. negotiating experience with North Korea in the 1990s. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, Mr. Einhorn, on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, Presidents Trump and Moon met and discussed ways to denuclearize North Korea. What did you think was the most notable out of that meeting?
Well, a few things. One, they didn't talk much about denuclearization, which is fine, because if the United States and the ROK had come closer, a common approach, it would be better to leave that to the working level talks rather than to expose what their position was in public now. But for me, the most notable thing was a comment by President Trump. He says he's reluctant to agree to another summit before he finds out whether the working level talks can make progress. This is quite positive. That was not the approach that President Trump took before Singapore, before Hanoi, where they agreed to go immediately to the leaders level, ignoring working level talks. So if Trump is serious that we must make progress at the working level before scheduling another summit, I think that's good.
Mm-hmm. And as Mr. Einhorn just mentioned, the two leaders didn't delve into specific denuclearization, but they just reaffirmed their previous pledge to not use force on North Korea and to provide bright future after it denuclearizes. Why do you think was that?
Well, I think it was consistent with the respective themes that the leaders have been emphasizing. For President Moon, the key to the inter-Korean issue is peace. And for President Trump, he really likes the idea of dangling the bright future out in front of Kim Jong-un as a way of trying to move this process forward. But I think also they didn't want to say anything that would give a pretext for North Korea not to come back to talks at this time. There's an expectation that talks will occur, but there's also sensitivities because a date has not been set for the resumption of working level talks.
Mm-hmm. And in the run-up to the working level talks, North Korea's chief nuclear negotiator to the six-party talks, Kim Jae-gun, made a statement and urged President Trump to make a bold and wise decision. And he also accused the rest of Washington of wanting to disarm North Korea first, and that it was the United States that didn't keep the agreements from the Singapore summit. So what do you make of Kim Jae-gun's statement?
Kim Jae-gun's statement was consistent with what the North Koreans have been saying over the last several months, which is that North Korea, according to North Koreans, have done their part to move negotiations forward. It's up to the United States. I think they want to put the onus on Washington to make a bold decision. And I think it also, Kim's statement is also consistent with the idea that depend on President Trump. He's the most reliable, he is the most flexible interlocutor. So Kim specifically called on President Trump to take a bold step.
Mm-hmm. And the week before, the current chief negotiator, Kim Myung-gil, welcomed President Trump of mentioning a new method. And ever since, there's been interpretations that the new method may be indicating a phased and step-by-step approach. So why do you think there's so much attention to this President Trump mentioning of a new method, both in North Korea and around the world?
Well, I think what was really interesting is that the North Koreans were emphasizing welcoming that statement. And I'm sure that President Trump was encouraged to say that as a way of trying to get things back on track. And also as a way of post-Bolton trying to signal maybe some kind of flexibility that may not have been there previously in the U.S. Negotiating position. So I do think that there is a signal there that the U.S. Is ready to take a more flexible, to engage in a more flexible process, but not necessarily compromise on the end goal or final outcome.
So,
if I could just add, I think people are reading too much into the departure of former National Security Advisor Bolton. It's true, John Bolton was very skeptical of any negotiations, any agreement with North Korea. But even after his departure, there will be important splits within the administration for those who want to take a hardline approach and those who want to take a more flexible approach. So don't read too much into that.
And there are growing expectations that both sides will have to show flexibility when they return to the table. And we are expecting working level talks in 2 to 3 weeks. So what approach do you think Special Representative Began should take?
I think it's important to move beyond the position that was taken in Hanoi. We have to, I would suggest what I call an interim agreement. Interim because it's a first step, not the end of the road. And I think it needs to focus on banning North Korea's production of fissile material anywhere in the country. Now, this is going to be difficult to the North because it involves actually declaring these activities that it is not prepared to admit. And allow inspectors to come to verify its declaration. So this is hard, and because it's hard, I would do it in stages. The first stage could be confined to Yongbyon, shut down Yongbyon. The North Koreans themselves have proposed that at Hanoi. Proceed from that to a second step, maybe 6 or 12 months later, and that's to declare facilities outside of Yongbyon where the North Koreans are engaged in enrichment activities. For example, the facility at Kangsang, which is known to the West, but until now not admitted by North Korea. A third step might come 12 months later, something like that, would be to extend the ban on fissile material production nationwide. This will be the hardest step. And I think what the U.S. should do is to provide incentives at every step of the way. First step, Yongbyon, relatively modest incentives, like declaring an end to the Korean War, establishing liaison offices in each side's capitals, humanitarian assistance. But as you proceed to more comprehensive steps, begin to enrich the compensation to include measures of sanctions relief, suspension of certain sanctions to enable inter-Korean projects like the Kaesong Industrial Complex or the Kumgang Mountain tourism projects. And then to go beyond that to nationwide, I think there could be more robust sanctions relief measures. For example, amending UN Security Council sanctions to permit imports by North Korea, such as imports of petroleum products. So I would calibrate it step by step.
Let me just try to comment on the way that Mr. Einhorn laid it out, because I think that what he did was to very effectively envisage how the unheld conversation that was ended by the decision of President Trump to leave could have played out if indeed working level negotiators had been able to continue to meet in Hanoi. And it also directs the conversation in a way that we have a phased process, but we still get to the objective of complete denuclearization. But I think that one of the problems is that in Hanoi, we simply didn't have an indication that North Korea had signed on to the objective of complete denuclearization. It seems like the deal that they wanted was a partial denuclearization deal or an incomplete denuclearization deal. And so I actually think that there may be more flexibility in the way that the U.S. couches its approach. I think that it's likely that instead of trying to eat the entire pie this time, that the U.S. would be willing to eat the pie in slices together with North Korea. But I still worry that we don't yet have consensus on the end goal that we're indeed going to eat the entire pie.
And Mr. Einhorn, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi announced that the House will now start inquiry into impeachment of President Trump. Would this have an impact on the denuclearization talks with North Korea?
I think one has to be modest about predicting the impact of the impeachment process on North Korean negotiations. On the one hand, one might assume that President Trump would become more eager for a deal that could deflect attention from impeachment and give him some kind of a foreign policy victory before his reelection. On the other hand, President Trump might conclude that defying the North, walking away from negotiations would be more popular. He saw the results of Hanoi, where he correctly walked away from what would have been a bad deal, and that was popular, not just with his political base, but with Democrats as well. So it's hard to tell. Also, there's a risk here that the North Koreans may miscalculate. They may think that President Trump is so desperate for a deal that he's prepared to show great flexibility to make major concessions. I think the North miscalculated in Hanoi. I think they believed that President Trump would accept the deal they offered, which was not a very good deal. So that there are risks here in trying to predict too much of this.
And there's a concern, I think, because this statement by Vice Minister Kim, it looks to target that gap between the president and the institutional bureaucracy that was essentially exposed by the impeachment issue. And so I worry that the North Koreans believe that they are going to be able to get from President Trump what they think that they cannot get from the institutional bureaucracy.
And at the UN General Assembly, South Korean President Moon Jae-in presented the idea of turning DMZ into an international peace zone. Last month, he presented the idea of a peace economy with North Korea. So what do you think of President Moon pushing ahead with his peace agenda at a time when there's no progress on denuclearization?
Well, it's not going to go very far without denuclearization, and I'm surely President Moon knows that, and yet this has been the wedge for political advantage for him. His core constituents, I think, are very supportive of the idea of peace. I was just at a DMZ forum in Korea where the Gyeonggi provincial governor, Lee Jae-myung, was blessing a forum that was very much defining the issues as related to trying to achieve peace, and really barely mentioned denuclearization in the main keynote statements. So I do think that this is a theme that appeals to Moon's main constituents, but I'm not sure it's where the overall public opinion is in Korea.
And Mr. Einhorn, President Moon seemed more eager than President Trump at the latest round of summit of holding another potential third summit between Washington and Pyongyang. Why do you think is that?
Well, I think President Moon is quite frustrated. His great ambition is a reconciliation of North and South. He's negotiated an important North-South reconciliation agenda. He would like to implement that agenda, but he's been impeded because of lack of progress in denuclearization and Moon's willingness to hold up on inter-Korean talks pending progress in denuclearization. So I think his eagerness for another summit meeting is an indication of his hope that this process can move forward. And in a way, he shares Kim Jong-un's view that Trump is the key rather than the bureaucracy. And so he's looking toward another summit to move the ball forward.
Well, we'll have to leave it here and now watch video for our next discussion.
좋지 않은 그 과거를 청산하고 앞으로 좋은 남단을 개척하려는 그 대통령이 그 남다른 용단의 그 비전이라고 생각합니다. 우리 역시 이미 천명한 대로 새로운 길을 모색하지 않을 수 없게 될 수도 있을 것이다.
Since Since a new round of nuclear diplomacy took hold last year, Chairman Kim tried to make a good impression on President Trump. He wrote multiple letters and greeted President Trump at the DMZ on short notice. Meanwhile, North Korean foreign ministry officials continue their fiery rhetoric against the United States. Now, Mr. Snyder, since Hanoi, it appears that Chairman Kim wants to only play the good cop and his officials the bad cop. Why do you think is that?
I think it's in part because what the levels negotiation represent for Kim Jong-un meeting with Trump represents legitimation. But working level negotiations for North Korea represent accountability. And basically what North Korea wants is legitimation, but they do not want accountability. They don't want verification. They don't want the hard work that comes with denuclearization. And so if they can get legitimation without accountability, I think that that's a big win for Kim Jong-un.
Mm-hmm. And how would you compare Kim Jong-un's negotiating style with his father, Kim Jong-il?
Well, the main difference, I think, is that Kim Jong-un has come out in front and therefore, in some ways, is more exposed than his father. Under Kim Jong-il, most of the negotiations occurred with Kim Jong-il behind the curtain, but very much controlling the negotiation. With Kim Jong-un, we see him exposed. We see him meeting with President Trump. We see him actually responding, in some cases, to media questions. But now he's made a pledge of complete denuclearization. And at least President Trump and Secretary Pompeo are really expecting him to honor that pledge. And if he doesn't, he could be caught out as someone who is not forthcoming in international dealings.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Einhorn, you met with Chairman Kim Jong-il with the Secretary Madeleine Albright back in 2000 when you were in Pyongyang. What could you read about his negotiating style?
Well, I was impressed with his mastery of detail. I'll give you an anecdote to describe that. Important business at that meeting was the missile negotiations. I was head of the U.S. delegation there. We prepared a list of about 14 specific questions about the missile negotiations. Chairman Kim looked at them and then began going one by one through those questions. And he gave quite detailed expert answers. We were very impressed with his knowledge of some of the specifics of the negotiations. But what was probably more impressive was he skipped over 4 or 5 questions. He wasn't prepared to pronounce himself on issues where he really didn't know. Knowing what you don't know is very important in negotiations. And here was a leader who's portrayed by North Korean media as omniscient, all-knowing. So despite his omniscience, he knew what he didn't know. And actually that 20-minute, 30-minute presentation amounted to more progress we had made in negotiations than about 4 years of working-level talks.
So in the 1990s and the 2000s, you negotiated with the North Korean officials who are still at the foreign ministry. So why do you think Vice Foreign Minister Choi Sun-hee is not taking the lead in the current nuclear negotiations?
We don't know. We can only speculate. Kim Yong-gil, who is apparently the interlocutor for Steve Biegun, he's a talented foreign ministry official. Maybe Madam Choi would prefer to be in the background. Being a North Korean negotiator, is not necessarily good for career advancement, as we saw after Hanoi.
And Mr. Snyder, you researched extensively on North Korea's negotiations with the United States back in the 1990s. So what do you think is consistent to now and different from then?
Well, the main difference is that Kim Jong-un is out in front, but a lot of the bureaucratic gamesmanship that exists in North Korean approaches toward the United States has really remained constant over the course of 20 years. Approaches on brinkmanship, the effort to try to induce concessions on the part of the United States by leaving the North Korean position vague while asking the U.S. to try to meet particular benchmarks. Those kinds of things, I think, have been constant. But Mr. Einhorn may have better observations on this since he had direct experience from the 90s.
I think when and if working level talks resume, and I'm hoping it's when rather than if, I think Steve Biegun can expect the North Koreans to sit back and say, okay, you Americans, you're responsible for the stalemate. As we've told you, we expect a new calculus on your part. So tell us what you have brought to the table to move negotiations forward. They will sit back and wait. And also one thing to expect is that the North Korean negotiators, at least in my experience, have been messengers. They haven't been negotiators with a lot of discretionary authority. I think they will have rigid instructions. I doubt that they're going to have much flexibility. I think they will wait to hear what they'll receive what they hear from Steve Biegun, take that back to Pyongyang, to Chairman Kim, and then hopefully the next round of negotiations can move things forward.
Yeah. And here is, I think, where we have a little bit of a chicken and egg dilemma, because we want working level talks in order to prepare for the leaders to make a decision. And yet, in North Korea, if the decision has not been made, there will be no progress in working level talks. And so I think that one of the big problems that we have is that we've had now President Trump meeting 3 times with the decision maker, but he hasn't made the decision that would be necessary to move this forward. And so you can make an argument for trying again for a 4th time, because we really need to hear from the decision maker in order to catalyze the implementation of the decision. And yet that also comes with costs in terms of further legitimation of the North Koreans, which I think is what they're after.
Can I just add to that? A critical takeaway, a critical outcome for the next working level talks is agreement that negotiations at that level will not be episodic. They will be regular. They will be not for a day, day and a half. They will be for a week or 2 weeks. They will break. Negotiators will go back to capitals. They will report to their leaders. They will get new guidance and then come back to the negotiating table. And this should go on almost constantly. 3 or 4 or 5 rounds of working level talks before engaging the leaders again. I think procedurally this is critical.
Well, we'll have to wait and see if the upcoming round of working level talks will become a regular one. Now we'll move on to our next segment. Now time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today we have a photo of North Koreans working at a construction site in Dakar, Senegal. VOA's investigative reporting discovered North Korea has quietly reopened a construction company in Senegal in violation of UN sanctions. Mr. Snyder?
Well, congratulations to the Korean service of VOA for doing some excellent reporting, following up on issues that have been raised by the panel of experts report. This is a constant challenge to hold the North Koreans accountable under sanctions. They're experts at sanctions evasion, and this is just another example of the way in which trying to impose sanctions on North Korea is kind of like playing a game of whack-a-mole. Something always pops up that you didn't anticipate in a different place.
Mr. Einhorn?
Not much to add to what Scott mentioned. The North Koreans are tremendously resourceful at finding their way to evade sanctions and exporting labor, whether it's labor for restaurants in China or this kind of activity, is an important source of hard currency for the North. And I think we can expect them to continue to be very active in finding these sources of revenue.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Mr. Snyder, Mr. Einhorn, thank you for joining us.
Our pleasure.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun-jung Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.